Hello and welcome in the second video in this Flutter tutorial. Today we are going to talk about a typical Flutter project structure. In the last video we got started with Flutter by installing Flutter SDK, and we created our first Flutter project and executed it as a web project, if you remember. I strongly recommend that you go and check the previous video if you didn't watch it before. Today we will be focusing more on how a typical Flutter project is structured. Also, we will get introduced to Dart, the underlying programming language for Flutter. So get yourself ready for this video. This will be some hands-on experience that you get after this video. So if you remember this slide from the last video, we said that when you write code in Dart, Flutter translates it to the corresponding language based on the target platform. Flutter supports multiple platforms, as you can see here, like Android, iOS, web, desktop. In this slide here, we see the direct mapping between those platforms and their corresponding folders in the project. Let's think about this as a journey from the beginning of working on uh, the project until the last step in the project, which is the output. So at the beginning, you write code in Dart, right? And if you remember, we said that Flutter is the framework, Dart is the language. So you start with Dart, you write Dart code. And where you write it in the lib project. Let's open this here. Uh, maybe put it side by side so that you can see both of the screens. Okay, so on the left side here, you can see the typical Flutter project. And on the right side here is the mapping and the description of the folders in this project. If you didn't see the last video, I recommend you to go and see it. If you didn't see it simply and you don't know how to create a new project, simply open the CMD and choose a suitable location for you. I recommend you to stay away from C because Flutter projects take some good amount of space. And then enter this command, flutter create, and write the app name, counter app, or whatever you want to name your app. And if you do this, you will get this project created by default using Flutter framework. So the start is from the Dart, and the lib stands for library. So this lib folder here contains the Dart code that you write. If you remember, we said that you only have to learn Dart, and then Flutter will convert the code into multiple languages. So instead of you having to learn Java, Swift, C++, you just learn Dart, and Flutter will handle everything for you. So let's imagine that you are now a Dart expert and you already wrote your first application. You will find the file called main.dart. It's created by default using the framework, the Flutter framework. When you create a new project, it creates a new template project for you. So this is the main.dart file. Now that we wrote the Dart code, let's assume that we finished writing it. The next step will be to visit the tests because any code needs to be tested, right? So if you go and open the test directory, you will find some tests here. And definitely we are going to create a separate video for talking in details about tests and how unit testing works in Flutter and what are the different types of testing out there. Just for your information, some takeaway here is that any test file must end with underscore test, as you can see here. So now we written the code in the lib and we tested it in the test. The next step is to define the dependencies in the pubspec file. The pubspec file is one of the most important files in the project. You will be probably using it a lot whenever you want to define a new package or a new dependency, or even you want to declare some assets in your project. This is what tells Flutter information about your project. So this file here is in the language, written in a language called YAML, which stands for yet another markup language. If you're not familiar with YAML, just don't get lost with those details. We are going to learn everything step by step. So this is a file. You see, it's pretty much simple file because we are creating a new project for now. The most important thing is maybe that it's identifying the name of your application, the version of your application, also defining the SDK for Flutter and Dart, and defining the dependencies. Right now, since this is a totally new project, there aren't any dependencies except Flutter SDK. And there are some comments here on how adding assets or fonts. Definitely we are going to get that in details later on. So yeah, that's it for now. Okay, so back to the folder structure again. We now wrote a code in lib folder or lib folder, and we tested it in test folder, and we specified the packages in the pubspec YAML file. What's next? So what's next is that if you remember from the last video, after executing the first application that we wrote together, we executed the command, if you remember, flutter run, and then we specify the device and say Chrome. And by specifying the device, we told Flutter to translate the code into web platform. So for each platform, you will find a folder to contain the translated code. So for example, Android for Android. And if you open Android, you will find Java files. This is, by the way, if you have any like previous experience with Android projects, you will know that this is a typical Android project. It's nothing fancy, nothing related to Flutter. It's just a typical Android project. You open the app and using Gradle build. If you open the main, you will find the Java files out there, the Kotlin files, the Android manifest, everything in place. This was done automatically by Flutter. You didn't do anything on your own. Those are automatically generated folders. And as we mentioned, corresponding to each platform, there is one folder. So the Android is for Android, and it contains Java files. iOS is for iOS, and it contains the Swift code. Web, for example, is for the web, and of course contains the HTML/JavaScript code. And for the desktop, we have the three folders: Windows, Linux, Mac OS, respectively. And each of them is having the C++ code out there. And again, all of this is generated automatically. You just care about, this is the power of Flutter actually, that you just care about Dart. You write in one language, and whenever you run the command flutter run and specify the platform, Flutter will translate it into the corresponding language automatically without you having to do any manual work. All right, so far so good. So what's next after translating the code from Dart to the corresponding languages? The final step would be generating the deliverables, because each platform depends on a specific deliverable. For example, Android, the typical Android application right here contains Java files, but the final output of this will be, if you are guys familiar with Android, you will know it. It's a file called APK, or recently some more advanced format is called AAB, or Android Application Bundle. So this is called the deliverable of the Android project. Also, the deliverable for web is JavaScript. The deliverable for Windows could be an exe. The deliverable for Linux is could be like a batch script or sh file. So all of these deliverables, when you build your application, are exported to the build directory. It's an automatically generated folder, and it contains all the deliverables of your project, and it's stem, by the way. For example, you can delete all these things right here, and you will not lose anything. That's totally fine. It will be just deleted, and when you do something again, it will be created again. So let's recap what we mentioned so far. So we mentioned that we will write the code in the lib directory. This will be where 90% of your time will be in this folder. And then after writing the code, we will write some tests. And then after that, we will specify the packages, versions, assets in the pubspec.yaml file. And then after this, Flutter, using the command flutter run or flutter debug, will translate the code into Android, iOS, Linux, Mac OS, web, Windows, whatever you choose. And by the way, you don't have to work with all of these platforms. Every platform is independent from the other, which means you can choose to work on Android. You don't have to necessarily work on iOS and Android together, or web. You can just choose web or delete the other folders. Each platform is independent from the other. And the output will be generated in the build directory. Great. So you see the highlighted folders here, you covered almost like 70% or maybe more from the folders inside this typical Flutter project. There are other files or maybe directories or folders that we are not going to mention. I believe those are the most important folders slash files that you need to know about. Don't bother yourself by trying to memorize these things. You will definitely get into it hands-on and in practice. Don't worry if you don't memorize things right now. Everything will get into its place at the right time. Those are the remaining files. Some of them are mandatory, some of them are optional or auxiliary. I will leave this presentation for you guys to educate yourself maybe more about the different files slash folders existing and the description or the function for each file. I will leave the link for this presentation in the description of the video. Great. So far you are now familiar with the folder structure of Flutter, and if there is only one folder that I need you to focus on will be the lib or lib folder. This, as mentioned, is the folder where you will spend probably 90% of your time working here. This is the main code, and this is the power of Flutter. It needs you, or it wants you to focus only on Dart, and it will handle everything for you automatically. So far so good. So let's move on. The next step is to discuss Dart, all right, and Dart syntax. Again, I'm repeating it. Dart is the language, Flutter is the framework. Dart is an independent language from Flutter. It's not necessarily to be used with Flutter as a framework. It comes standalone. And it's not always related to Flutter. It could be like a normal language where you can write normal code and do other stuff rather than mobile development or web development or something like this. So to get started to Flutter, because the Flutter application simply is a Dart application, right? So we need to understand Dart syntax before. And every Dart application will have an entry point, and maybe a very good exercise will be to start with writing the very first Dart program hands-on. So let's try together. In the previous video, we installed the Flutter SDK. And what SDK stands for is Software Development Kit. And as the name implies, it's a kit, which means that it contains a lot of things. It's not just Flutter, it's not just Dart, it's a combination of Flutter, Dart, and other useful libraries slash frameworks that you will need to use Flutter. So along with this SDK, you already installed Dart. And if you want to make sure that this happened, you can write the command from the CMD. I'm going to just zoom in a bit. Yeah, you can write where Dart. And the where command explains to you where exactly is your Dart executable. And as you see, if you remember from the last video, this is where we installed our Flutter SDK, and the Dart exists inside the SDK. Why? Because as we mentioned, the SDK is a software development kit, which means that it contains a lot of things. Flutter framework, Dart standalone code, as well as other useful stuff that you are going to need. So this means that we already have Dart installed standalone, not related to Flutter. So this means that we can now say Dart version, right? So now that's great. Dart SDK version, and it starts responding. This means that we can execute Dart independently now. So let's make use of this and maybe try to write our first Dart code. Go to your favorable IDE. For me, to be honest, I prefer CMD. So I'm going to create a file in the favorable location for you. I'm going to go to the desktop and I'm going to make a new file. Let's call it test.dart. This will be the first file, Dart file that we are going to write. With this command on Windows, you can write whatever. On Mac, I think Mac, you can just write touch test.dart. I'm just creating a new test.dart file and writing anything to it. Nothing fancy with it. And I'm just going to open it with Notepad. So I'm just going to clear this dot here. And this is an empty file called test.dart. Right here, you can write the first Dart program. For any Dart program to work, just like any programming language, there is something called entry point, which is the main method that this program is going to execute. So in Dart, it's, as you can see here, it's called main. It must be called main, and it's of type void. And you just write here whatever code you want to write. And then I'm going to save this file. So right here, this is the very first line of code that we will write in Dart. Main is the entry point or the main method. It must be called main and it must be a void, and it doesn't take any arguments. And as you can see here, you can just write whatever you want to write. We can write print, for example, hello world, and semicolon. I'm writing Dart syntax. It's a bit similar to maybe JavaScript syntax, if you are familiar to it. We will talk in a bit about the Dart syntax and what are useful resources for Dart. Right now, what I just want you to make is to get back to your CMD again and make sure that you are in the same directory where this test.dart file exists, and then simply run the command Dart space and then give the name of the file, which is test.dart, and then hit enter, and here we go. Congratulations, this is your first Dart program that you write. It's a very simple program that prints something to the console, and we learned about the entry point. It's a void and it must be called main and taking no constructors at all. I assume you have some like good experience with the basics of programming at least. It's very, very useful for you. If not, maybe you can go and try to train yourself on some JavaScript or something. This is the most similar programming language to Dart. So, anyways, let's move on. Now, after we have created our first Dart program, the next step here is to get familiar with some resources from Dart. Of course, the official documentation is like more than enough, to be honest, to get you started with Dart. You can find there the fundamentals, even if you don't have any like prior knowledge about programming. It could be a very good starting point for you. So if you go to dart.dev/language, you can find here the basics and the fundamentals of Dart. It's going to give you an introduction. Here you find the entry point for the application. It must be void and it must be called main, as we mentioned. It's just printing something. Then it's going to gradually introduce you to the variables and how to define variables. You see, it's very similar to JavaScript, nothing fancy. Then, like the typical introduction for any syntax, it starts with the control flow, which is the if conditions, while conditions, and starting with the functions. By the way, Dart is a strictly typed language, which means that you need to define the type of each object, and it's considered object-oriented as well. Here is some code about comments, imports, classes. Of course, we're going to work with classes a lot. Another useful resource is for the Dart. It's called dart.dev/codelabs/Dart cheat sheet. I'm going to give you guys the links in the description. You can even just Google it. Dartpad, yeah, this is a Dartpad. It's very useful. It's used to, like online, write any code without having to have any SDK installed or something. So you can have fun here learning some code examples, learning about string interpolation and seeing some hands-on experience and stuff like that. So now, after we learned about Dart, so Flutter is nothing special, right? Flutter application is just a Dart application. So getting to know Dart first will help you a lot understanding Flutter, because as we mentioned, Flutter is just a framework. Dart is the main programming language. So if you go again now to our project, and I'm going to open the counter app. I'm going to open the lib folder. If you remember, we said lib is the main folder that we are going to be working with. And then I'm going to open the main.dart file. This is the file that's automatically created by the Flutter framework whenever we create a new project. It's a typical application. We tried to run this application before, right? And if you remember, we said Flutter run device Chrome. This is a bit different from running normal Dart applications. Why? Because simply this is not a simple or a typical Dart application. If it was a typical Dart application, we would run it as Dart main.dart. But this time we're saying Flutter run. This means that we are mainly delegating Flutter to handle everything in this project. This means that Flutter will search on the necessary files in this directory, like the pubspec file, which is very important. Without it, Flutter is not going to run. And then Flutter is going to translate this into the different languages based on the platform. And as I said, you are simply delegating Flutter to handle everything related to this application, and instead of just simply dealing with it as a normal Dart file. So this is nothing more than a Dart file. It contains the main, you remember, the entry point. but this time it contains something different, a method called run app, which runs your app and it takes an input your application. And this method lies in the Flutter material.dart, Flutter package. So I think this makes sense, right? Because we're saying Flutter application is nothing more than a Dart application, but using the Flutter framework. And this is exactly what you are seeing now in front of your eyes, right? You're seeing a normal main.dart file containing the entry point, but instead of just running normal code, I'm just running a method called run app that comes from a package called Flutter, because Flutter is a framework. I think things are starting to get familiar by the time and starting to make sense, right? Um, then down here, you're going to find the definition for this class. You are passing an instance from the MyApp class, and this is the definition of the MyApp class. And here are some auxiliary classes, which we can get rid, by the way, of all of them right now and create our custom application. We executed this before. Maybe we have another look as a refresher for you guys to know what is this exactly. Oops, I made an error. I just ran the command in the wrong direction. I need to go to the right directory, push df, and I'm going to cd to my projects, and I'm going to cd again to, yes, I'm going to go to the counter app, make sure to be in the counter app as well here, and then you run this again, flutter run chrome. Now Flutter will search in the directory, on the lib directory, on the pubspec file, and if it finds everything fine, it will start launching the application on Chrome as we show in the previous video. Um, so I think now we are getting familiar step by step with Flutter application. We still need to discuss this class here and what's its function and how it's reflected to the final application that we see here on the right side of the screen. You can go on and read this by yourself. Don't worry if you have a lot of things that you cannot understand. We are still going to have more and more videos to explain this in details. This is the application that we created, and those are the three main classes responsible for this application. In the next video, we are going to customize this application and start getting to know the internal details of the Flutter class itself, how it works, and what are the different types of classes, widgets, user interface components are there in Flutter. So stay tuned for the next video and see you guys soon. Thank you.